Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel on the tools and rules for responsible artificial intelligence. My name is Abigail Hing Wen, and I am an author and speaker. I've worked in artificial intelligence, hosting Intel's AI podcast, and most recently with the Partnership on AI. I am really excited to be joined today by three amazing experts in this field. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick introduction, talk a little bit about the panel on artificial intelligence and ethics, and then we will get into a discussion. So Tulsi Doshi is head of product for Google's Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technology Organization. She's also the AI ethics advisor to Lemon Insurance and leading efforts to build more equitable, intentional, and accountable user experiences into their products. She is also a Forbes 30 under 30 for this year with expertise in product management for machine learning products. Reed Blackman is the founder and CEO of Virtue, where he works with companies to integrate ethical risk mitigation into the development and deployment of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. He's also the author of Ethical Machines, which is forthcoming from Harvard Business Review in July of this year. And finally, Manish Raghavan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Center for Research on Computation and Society. He'll be joining the faculty at the MIT Sloan School of Management and Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science as an assistant professor starting this fall. So I'd love to start off, talking about there is no single right way to operationalize AI ethics. There's many different values across companies, and we are still in the first innings of development of this technology. So I'm really excited for this opportunity to have a conversation about some of the best practices that we're seeing, some of the challenges that are rising, and what each of you guys are doing in your respective fields. So can we kick it off with maybe giving me a quick intro to some of your work, and then also tackle the question, how do you define AI ethics? And historically, what are some of the best examples of AI ethics issues emerging?
I guess I can start. So thank you so much for that intro and excited to be here and chatting with all of you. As I think was mentioned in the intro, I lead product for responsible AI efforts at Google. And so that means I work across the diversity of our product portfolio, whether that's YouTube or search or ads or photos or Nest, to really think about what does it mean to build products that are inclusive, to build products that embody responsible AI considerations, being accountable to our users, being safe, being effective. For every user who uses them. And I think that for me is really what AI ethics embodies. Like it really embodies a practice of making sure that the machine learning systems that we build put users first in every sense of that word, right? And making sure that they are inclusive, that they work for every user, but that we also are creating them with intentionality about the impacts that they can have, both for the users who are using them and the many users who may not be. And I think it's really about both how we build products, how we talk about products, and the system that we build alongside that in terms of who is building these products and in what ways.
Thank you. Reed?
So the question is, what is AI ethics all about? Is that sort of the question?
Yeah, and tell us a bit more about yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you said, I'm the founder and CEO of Virtue, which is an ethics consultancy specializing in artificial intelligence. I have a book coming out, Ethical Machines, with Harvard Business Review in July. Prior to doing all this, I was a professor of philosophy for 10 years, mostly at Colgate University, a year at UNC Chapel Hill, and then of course, 10 years prior to that, grad school, PhD, all that. So I've been studying, teaching, researching, publishing on ethics for over 20 years. Anyway, that's where I come from. And now I spend most of my time, if I'm not writing, then I'm advising senior leaders on how to put AI ethics into practice. I want to reiterate, or at least just echo, or give a thumbs up to it's everything that Tulsi said. She's absolutely right. The one thing that I suppose I would add is that one of the reasons that we're not seeing as much AI ethics in practice as we ought to is just a lack of senior leadership. AI ethics doesn't work. And I should say, by the way, that I think the thing that we ought to prioritize when we talk about AI ethics is AI ethical risk mitigation. So it's one thing to do a bunch of good in the world, which is great, but first and foremost, do no harm. So I think the thing that we need to focus on is risk mitigation, both from an ethical perspective and from a brand reputation business perspective. Don't tarnish your brand by doing ethically problematic things. In my view, AI ethics doesn't really work very well without buy-in from senior leadership. And that means more than just, yeah, go ahead and do it, you're allowed to, but ensuring that it's built into your overall AI strategy, that it's woven through how you think about financial incentives for employees, how you think about roles and responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just to supplement, certainly not replace what Tulsi just said.
Yeah, thank you. Manish?
Yeah, so just a little bit more about me. I come from a computer science background. Most of my research has been on artificial intelligence and machine learning and what it means to think about questions of discrimination, of bias, of fairness, of accountability in that context. And yeah, I definitely agree with everything that's been said thus far. I think one thing that I would add from my own perspective is a lot of the work that we do ends up being for AI used in the public sector or AI used by smaller companies. And a lot of the time, there's I think, a tendency to want to have people self-regulate in some sense, or to just voluntarily take on these ethical principles. And I think a number of companies are doing this and have put a lot of resources into it. But there are those that don't. And there are uses of AI and machine learning that people are thinking a little bit less about the ethical concerns involved. And so the one piece I would add is that when there's no internal will, or when there's little internal will to try to develop these ethical principles and implement them, there's also room to think about external pressures and regulatory pressures and that sort of thing that can try to impose some sort of standards on the types of decision making that people use AI for.
Well, thank you. So I'm excited to dig in deeper. For those listening into the panel, please go ahead and feel free to put comments into the chat or questions. We may not get to all of the questions, but we will certainly answer them and follow up on the Slack channel afterwards as well. So, so I think we're all in agreement that it's important to have buy-in from the top. We're going to need buy-in at every step of the way, including by the engineers on the ground, who are some of the pioneers of building the technology from the ground up. So why don't we get into some specifics for companies, especially that are beginning to invest heavily in artificial intelligence? What are some of those big early mistakes that early pioneers have made, and how can companies avoid repeating them today?
I'm happy to just, I can give one class of examples that I think is instructive. Most of machine learning is designed to work well in the average case in general. And so, you can look at a system and say, in general, in the typical case, this seems to be doing really well. And we often fail to account for the atypical case that can go very, very horribly wrong. I think this can especially be exacerbated in a world where people are sort of adversarial. If people remember the chatbot that Microsoft released several years ago, and it went horribly awry. In the normal case, in their test conditions, it seemed to be working fine. But it was, and in fact, I believe they've been using a version of this for sort of counseling help in a different language market, actually in China. But somehow, when they tried to deploy it for a different use case, it went haywire. And partially it was because adversarial setting, they hadn't modeled it properly, and partly because it wasn't the average case that we should be worried about. It's that sometimes individual examples can go very, very wrong. And we should expect that to happen. We should, as I think Reed was talking about with sort of risk mitigation, we should view this as a typical risk that comes along with the deployment of machine learning, that mistakes will be made, and we need to be okay with those and somehow handle them in a way that I think we're not really set out to do now.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. And I want to also just emphasize that in some ways, that's not so distinct from product development, right? And it's really about making sure that we're thinking about, we always do, testing and evaluation, we run experiments. That's a part of the product development process. And I think that really highlighting Manish's point about not focusing on the average, right? But making sure that you're actually looking at the diversity of your users, of your data, of examples. We can't avoid the fact that models will make mistakes, and we do need to have the right guardrails and accountability for that. But we also can do a lot to preempt possible mistakes if we are careful in the metrics that we develop, right? And being really intentional about making sure that we're slicing those metrics in different ways, that we're developing a diversity of metrics to measure different types of outcomes. I think there's a lot we can do there. And I think to add on top of that, I think that when you ask, like, what are the common mistakes that companies make? I think that the mistakes kind of go throughout the product lifecycle, right? Starting from like when you're even defining the product that you're trying to build in the first place, because in that definition process, I think we often don't fully ask, okay, who is this going to work for? Who is this not going to work for? What things do I need to account for? And especially when you think about an MVP mindset where you're like, how do I build the smallest, fastest version of this product? You inherently leave out assumptions and nuances that I think will later lead to some of those mistakes, right? And so how do we start at every phase of that process, whether that's the definition of the product, the collection of data, to then, the training and evaluation of the model, to then the other design and guardrails and feedback loops we put in place. I think there's opportunities at every stage of that life cycle for us to be more intentional about what we're doing.
And Tulsi, if I can just stay with that point for a moment with you, what we've seen the iconic headlines with the algorithms that don't associate women with leadership roles, or the facial recognition software that doesn't work on darker skin as effectively. What are some of the other categories of diversity that you're running into that maybe people may not be thinking about?
That's a good question. I think you are right that there, I think, are common failure modes and common types of risks and harms that we've seen time and again. I think, for one thing, I'll call out that a lot of what we talk about in the press today is very Western centric, right? We're talking about failure modes that are related to communities in the United States. But I think a lot of these concerns around fairness, around systemic racism and bias actually differ pretty significantly when you go to different regions, right? So what you might think about in India, for example, with relationship to caste and similar issues of leadership positions, employment, issues of toxicity and sexualization. These are concerns that are not specific to communities in the United States. And in fact, can be exacerbated in other languages and regions. And because a lot of these companies are US-based companies, I think often when we stress test our own systems, we stress test in the languages we understand and we speak, right? And so I think there's a big question in my mind of how do we make sure that these conversations and these feedback mechanisms are more globalized.
Absolutely. And even a large part of the world that is not even online yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great. Manish and Reed.
Yeah, so I wanted to answer that question about what are the mistakes that are made. There are lots. Here are a handful. Number one, biggest mistake, they do nothing. They do absolutely nothing. They just hope. Their strategy is one of hope. We hope nothing goes wrong. We hope it's going to be fine. That's, by the way, if they know enough that they ought to be hoping. Sometimes the mistake is they're just not sufficiently informed of the risks, and so they don't even know enough to hope that nothing goes wrong. Then they do know what could go wrong, so then they hope that things won't go wrong. Then a related mistake is they don't make it clear who owns the problem within the organization. Is it the CIO? Is it the chief data officer? Is it the chief analytics officer? Chief data and analytics officer? Is it the SVP of engineering? Is it the head of product? Is it, and on and on and on. So one of the major mistakes is that there's often no ownership of the problem, which, by the way, is essential, because if you make the mistake of not assigning a senior level owner to the problem, then you're not going to get the requisite resources that are needed in order to solve the problem. So for instance, you're not going to get the right kinds of financial incentives, you're not going to hire for the right kinds of roles, so on and so forth. Another kind of mistake has to do with the first steps that people make in trying to solve the problem, which are usually far too high level and generic to solve anything at all, like coming up with 7 principles that mean nothing. Where for fairness, congratulations, the KKK says they're for fairness too. They have a different conception about how to operationalize fairness, but nonetheless, they can sign a piece of paper that says, we are for fairness. So if your AI ethics principles, if you've come up with them, say, we're for fairness, and we're going to ensure that all of our stuff is fair, is as specific as you get, then the mistake is you spent a lot of time, and some organizations I know literally spend a year or two coming up with strong agreement on an advanced set of principles, but they're so watered down that they don't mean it. We're for privacy. Okay, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that you're just going to comply with GDPR and CCPA where appropriate? Are you talking about cybersecurity practices? Are you talking about user control over their data? If you just say, we're for privacy and we're going to make sure that we respect people's privacy, that doesn't mean anything outside of a further specification of what you mean by privacy. So that's another mistake, is just I use the word commitment loosely, but it's a sort of alleged commitment to a set of ethical principles that are so vague as to not commit one to anything at all.
Right. So if we were to
Yeah.
take the CIO and just, decide we're going to assign him as the key person responsible for ethics in the company, how would you define his job description? How would you set up metrics so that he or she knows that they are meeting them and that they are being successful for AI and ethics in particular?
Yeah. So I have this general view, which is that, okay, so I think that organizations first need to get really clear about what their ethical standards are. And that has to go well beyond an articulation of high-level principles. I think the jump to KPIs, to metrics, is far too soon until you actually have a deep understanding of what you're trying to, in the case of risk, what you're trying to avoid. And that can vary by organization. So to give you a sort of, so look, how are we doing on explainability? I don't know. What are your standards for when explainability is a necessary condition for deployment versus a nice to have? Do we think that explainability is a requirement in every case? And when we say explainable, to whom must it be explainable? Do we mean it just has to be explainable to the data scientist using tools like Lime and Chap? Do we mean it has to be explainable to the users of the product, say a fraud detection agent who's going to use the AI, who's going to look at certain kinds of potential fraud cases that the AI has flagged? Do we mean it has to be explainable to the end user, the layperson who doesn't know anything about data, let alone metadata or Lime and Chap and all that? So I don't think that you get to measure anything until you actually dig deep on all these issues. And so the first thing I think that that sort of leader needs to do is, okay, first step, let's get really clear on what it is we're trying to accomplish, or more specifically, what it is that we're desperately trying to avoid. And when you go deep on that, now you can get clear on, okay, then what are the metrics for such a thing?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also an interesting point there in terms of when we talk about metrics or KPIs, I think also important to acknowledge that there isn't necessarily a one size fits all metric for any of these things. And I think Reed is alluding to that when he's talking about explainability having potentially different users or different outcomes or different needs. But I think that's not even just true at a company level, right? It's true at like an individual product or feature level, where likely every single product or feature that you have is going to have different needs in terms of explainability, in terms of fairness, in terms of safety. Those metrics that they will need to evaluate, therefore need to be different. And so I think another common mistake is to assume that you can define a metric and then apply that metric everywhere and treat that as kind of a standard part of process, as opposed to acknowledging that there's probably a systemic framework you can adopt, but that framework is going to require thinking critically about which metrics you want for what use cases and what needs.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is I often see this conflation where in the machine learning community, we love to intrinsically care about metrics. Accuracy is something that you're sort of instilled in you to care about as a data scientist or as a machine learning person. But fundamentally, we don't actually care about the metric. We care about some thing in the world, some outcomes in the world, and our metric is our window into observing that. But overly focusing on the metric itself really runs the risk of losing sight of the actual outcome in the world that we're trying to move or thing that we're trying to change.
Absolutely. And so if we were to drill in a little further, like on the technical side, how helpful is transparency and explainability? How helpful is that to getting to the root cause of ethical issues? And how can companies leverage that to come to some of the answers for these questions that you're raising now?
I don't know if there's a good generic answer to that question. In my view, it depends heavily on the problem in question. Some of the ethical issues that you see, explainability or transparency isn't going to be the thing that solves them. Like if you're using facial recognition in a context that fundamentally you should not be using facial recognition, and transparency into the algorithm itself is not going to fix that problem for you, nor is it going to make it even apparent what the problem is. So for something like, we should add explainability or we should add transparency to this model. In certain contexts, I think it can be helpful, but again, it has to be done with a goal in mind. It has to be done with an eye towards some improvement that you're looking for, as opposed to with the hope that as a generic strategy, this will turn up something useful.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, sir, go ahead. No, you go.
I was just going to say, I think plus one to everything Manish just said. I think I have mixed feelings about often when we talk about transparency and explainability, because I do think they're critically important, right? And I do think that they are critically important for a number of reasons. One is, I think they hold ourselves accountable, right? So when we have to be transparent about the algorithms we build, it forces us to also think about the decisions that we're making, because documenting those decisions puts them in a context that you have to rationalize those decisions. And I think often it forces the critical thinking that I think is important. It also allows for those who do want to learn more about the model and who do want to have that kind of insight to have that understanding and be able to build on top of it, right? So I actually do think as a practice, transparency is incredibly important. And I think explainability goes back to Reed's very valid questions around to whom, for what reason, in what way, right? And I think, again, very important, right? I think in different structures for different individuals. I don't think either of those is by itself a solution to AI ethics concerns, right? In the same way that a single metric is not a solution, I think these things work together in concert to provide the right outcome, right? Like, because especially if you never explain your decisions to a user, then even if you have the most inclusive system in the world, the user only has certain windows into that. And again, inclusive to who, right? There's no such thing as inclusive to everyone in every environment. And so I think these things have to work together to actually get to the right outcome, but they're not necessarily solutions by themselves.
So also +1 to that. Look, when you ask whether explainability and transparency, to what extent does it solve the ethical problems, there's several reasons why it couldn't possibly. One is, and this is what Tulsi, I take it, alluded to, is that when we're talking about explainability, first of all, it's ambiguous between explanations about why people did what they did. That is to say, why did developers develop as they did? Why did they use this training data versus that training data? Why did they choose this objective function? Why this threshold? Why did they weight the variables the way that they did? Blah, 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 blah. So all those things are, you can explain why people did those things. And then that's separate from issues about what you can call machine explanations, which is roughly what's going on between the inputs and the outputs of a model. And so that's one distinction between the people explanations and what I call people explanations and machine explanations. When it comes to machine explanations, then you've got global explanations and local explanations. So global explanations are, what are the rules of the game here? What are the rules that transform inputs to outputs? And then local explanations are, why did this particular input lead to this particular output? Why did this particular person get denied a loan? As opposed to, what are the rules by which you decide whether or not somebody gets a loan? In all those cases of explanation, there's two things to draw attention to in light of your question. One is that there's loads of ethical questions that don't have anything to do with explainability. And this is what Manish was talking about, I take it. So there are issues about fairness or undue manipulation or, I don't know, environmental impact that have nothing to do with any of that stuff. The second thing is that one of the reasons why we want explanations in the first place is because if we don't know why someone did what they did, then we can't assess whether it's behaving that way, whether it's a person or a machine, is justified in acting in that way. So when we use certain tools or methods at getting to an explainable model, let's say we get global explanations for why the model behaves as it does, that's only at best setting the stage for us to ask the ethical question: are these rules justifiable, fair, just, reasonable, good, impartial, objective, so on and so forth. So at best, it's the entry point to asking a bunch of ethical questions. It certainly can't be the solution.
Other thoughts here? I think, one thing I think I'm definitely struck by is something that, we've talked about in other panels as well, and the importance of raising the right questions. And to do that, we're going to need a diverse group of people who are going to see the gaps and where the technology is not working or falling short. Can you talk a bit about diversity inclusion and how you're seeing that incorporated into teams and AI teams, especially today?
I mean, I think there's still a lot of work for us to do there. I think that there is more awareness and accountability of how important it is to build environments that are diverse and inclusive, to bring in different perspectives into the table. But I think the industry as a whole has, a walk to walk in terms of bringing in more perspectives into the workplace. I think your question kind of has two parts to it. One is like, why is that important, right? And then the other is like, what are we doing about it? I think it is critically important because everything we just talked about comes into play when you have different perspectives who are thinking about your metrics, who are thinking about whether or not you should even be using machine learning in this use case, whether or not it's working for one community versus another. I think the more perspectives you bring to the table, the more likely it is you're going to be thinking holistically about the problem space and actually just building better products that work in better ways for users. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge, though, that even as we continue to improve the diversity of our workforces, that our workforces by their very nature are more homogenous, and that, you know, everyone works for the same company, they're in the same environment on a regular day-to-day basis. And so I think it's also important that we acknowledge, like, how do we actually bring communities who are not in the workforce into the discussion, and what are the ways we do that, right? Microsoft has published on community juries. There's different, you know, ideas and formats that different organizations have been trying to adopt in terms of how to bring the conversation outside of the walls of the organization. And I think that's also something that I think is we're going to see growing in dialogue and hopefully feasibility over the next few years.
Absolutely. And Amish, actually, I would love to hear from you, especially that I know you've done research with a particular focus on algorithmic tools and the hiring pipeline. And pipeline issues are huge in this area. Can you talk a bit about what you're finding there? What are the challenges and some of the solutions as well?
Yeah. So particularly for the question of bringing more diverse voices into the sort of rooms that are building these products, that's less a question of algorithmic tools per se. I would say where we really see algorithmic tools being used in the hiring pipeline is for sort of high turnover, low wage work. That's the sort of target audience there. And in a sense, it's because people who do higher wage work maybe think that it is harder to do selection and screening for their own job. So I don't know if the algorithmic nature of these tools really provide much insight here. I think the one thing that I would add, or just re-emphasize from what Dulcie said, is there was this initial hope, I think, maybe 5-10 years ago, when people were talking about questions of responsible AI as they were just starting to come up. And there was a hope that a lot of this stuff could be mechanized in some sense, that if you could just think of the right things to measure right now, you could take that and apply it broadly everywhere. And to some extent, that would remove the need to think about the more complex issues that come up. But as you pointed out, no, this really isn't something that can be automated away. It's something that we constantly need a diverse group of people asking the right questions. And sometimes we'll fail to ask the right questions and we'll get things wrong. But I think we should really view it as the more different voices that can be brought into the room, the more chance we'll have of actually hitting upon those key questions that we really need to be asking before deploying these products into the world.
So I'm going to say something that I can't tell whether it's controversial. Probably it's controversial, but so let's go for it. Okay, so look, having diverse teams is a good thing. 100%, no question. It's a goal for which we should strive. 100%, no question. It's the best risk mitigation strategy. I don't see that. I don't see any empirical evidence for that claim. It might be a good one. By the way, one of the mistakes that this is sort of speaks to one of the early questions you asked, is what are the mistakes people make, is that the conversation of AI ethics very quickly becomes a question about bias in AI. Even though there's tons of other ethical risks associated with AI, the bias becomes the thing. And then we start talking about diverse teams being the appropriate risk mitigation strategy, or at least bias mitigation strategy. So look, I don't know that it's the best bias mitigation strategy. The rationale for it comes from, I take it, other kinds of examples outside of the AI world. So you talk about things like seatbelt design, and seatbelts were designed for average sized males in America. So they're not well designed for women, especially pregnant women or short people like me. And so, but if there were women involved in that process, they would have designed seatbelts that were more inclusive or something like that. Or you take the so-called racist soap dispenser, it's a bunch of white engineers. They trained the soap dispenser on their white hands, so it wasn't good at recognizing darker skinned hands, and so it wouldn't dispense to, say, Black people. And then the thought is, if they had Black engineers involved in that process, then they would have had a less biased soap dispenser. Now let's grant all that for the sake of argument. That seems totally plausible to me. Is it the case that if you have a more diverse group developing ML, then you're going to get less biased results? That's one question. And the second question is that the best risk mitigation strategy, or even just bias mitigation strategy? With regards to the latter question, I really hope not, because it's a multi-generational goal, number one. to get something like parity between the population and who's developing these models. A noble goal, one for which we should strive, but it's a multi-generational goal, and we're facing very real problems right here, right now. The second issue is that the stakeholders that are impacted are basically every kind of person in the world. We can't possibly get them all involved, right? So yes, you can get some Black people who live in America. Maybe you can get a couple of Southeast Asian women, but the diversity of humanity is not going to be able to be baked. If what we require for robust bias mitigation is representation by all kinds of people, that's an impossibility. I think that there are, and then on whether and then the thing is, there's loads of bias mitigation strategies, not to mention ethical risk mitigation strategies that require a certain kind of knowledge and expertise that are not had simply by virtue of being a member of a certain population. So again, all for diverse teams, we should strive for them. Oh, also the other problem is that, let's say you're head of data science and you don't have a budget to hire any more people and you've got a relatively homogeneous group. Do you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, look, I don't have a budget to hire more people, and the bias mitigation strategy is the more diverse team, so I guess I'm out of luck here? Of course not. So I applaud and endorse the view that we need diverse teams, but I don't think it ought to take center stage in discussions about what companies should be doing right here, right now, for not just bias mitigation, but ethical risk mitigation across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few thoughts on that point. I think it's absolutely a fair point to say that, like, it is increasing diversity of your workforce is one of many things that companies need to do to take accountability for the products that they're building and the models that they're building, right? And I also think there's a difference actually between risk mitigation. I think you brought this up, Reed, at the beginning too, risk mitigation and like opportunity creation, or like building, products that meet needs for different users, right? Like those are related but different. And so I think it's important to recognize that bringing in diversity of perspectives is an important part of the process, and it likely will lead to better products, right? That are created in better ways. That's not a be-all end-all solution, and it shouldn't be, right? And that you also can't put the burden on the shoulders of one person to shoulder an entire community or the representation of that work, right? And so I think we do need to be conscious of broader strategies and the fact that this is like a holistic story, right? I think the other thing I'll call out is I think diversity can mean different things. I think often when we talk about diversity in the workforce, we talk about demographic diversity, which is incredibly important. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that diversity in discipline is also important, right? So bringing in perspectives from computer science is obviously what traditionally dominates our tech companies, but also bringing in social science perspectives, bringing in design perspectives, bringing in like legal and operational perspectives, right? Like that is also a diversity that is needed if you want to build products that really are thoughtful and intentional in the full space. And I think, we're spending a lot more time, I've been spending a lot more time working with individuals who have backgrounds in civil and human rights. And that's been incredible in the way that they approach problem spaces because of the disciplines that they've thought through and the educational background that they have. And so I think that it is also not just about demographics when we talk about diversity of the workforce, though I will say that's critical.
No, I absolutely agree that it's definitely critical to have a diversity of fields represented and thought leadership. Manish, did you want to add to this one?
I think the two of them together really covered the whole space. So
I tried to start a fight. I tried to see something controversial, and no one wants to fight. It's too bad.
No, it's fair. I mean, diversity, to your point, is it's a responsibility of everyone. Like we all need to be thinking about people who are not like us, and not just rely on those people to speak. And I think, the other aspect we could think about too is, the role of consultants. You're right, like startups may not have the luxury of being able to hire every single person they need to reflect the diversity of the people impacted by their products. But there are groups like Arize and the Partnership on AI and many other nonprofits that are now out there doing a lot of good work in this area and doing some of that diversity work as well. So I think the more of those and the more support and visibility we can give them, the more helpful it is for the companies that need to be using them. So if I could ask us to think a little bit about one step of the development and deployment cycle, and that is the point of shipping. And of course, there's no one size fits all here, but I'd love to hear how you would think about a problem if you have if say you're advising the decision maker who's going to ship a product, is it ready to be deployed in the market, and yet we know it has these ethical issues, and let's say it's a safety issue, it doesn't work as well on certain populations or demographics. How do you think through that problem and whether or not it's ready to ship, and how do you strike a balance of getting to market and iterating versus holding back till it's ready?
I guess I can take that as a starting point. It's a hard question, and I think it depends product to product and use case to use case, right? And I think that it's always about this harm benefit trade-off. So what is the value that the product is providing? What is the benefit that it's providing? And then what are the potential harms and the potential risks of the product? And how severe are those harms and how frequent are those harms, right? I think are also an important part of how you determine kind of this relative risk mitigation. And I think that's also important for each community, right? I think like often, if you think about it as like, oh, well, this benefits the majority and it harms this minority, that's a problem, right? Like we should be thinking about for a given community, what is the benefit and harm trade-off for that community if this were to go live? And then I think then you can have conversations from there in terms of, okay, what are our guardrails? What are we comfortable with in terms of the trade-off there? And then what would it take to get to a place where we are comfortable in terms of that harm benefit trade-off? And so I don't think there's a single answer there, kind of the same way that there's not like a single metric. But I do think it's important to have that conversation. And I think something you're touching on is like, how does that affect our ability to like move fast and iterate and meet deadlines and things like that? And I think my answer to that is, yes, I think in some cases, this does mean slowing down a little bit. It means taking that step to say, wait a second, what is the impact of this? But I also hope that if we start building more of these concepts into the product development process from the get-go, that this is not one of those things where you reach a week before launch and you're like, dang it, like now I might have to hold my awesome launch because I didn't think about all of these things. Ideally, we get to a mode of operation more where these conversations have been had starting day one. So by the time you reach the week of launch, you do know what you're thinking about and what you've been considering and what trade-offs you've been thinking about. Or what opportunities you've been thinking about.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that last piece and really emphasize that it should be a question of design, not a question of decision making, right? That it's not like you, as you said, it's not like you just show up on the last day and then start to think about all the problems that you might be causing in the world and what you're going to do about them. In principle, this is something that you would have been thinking about all along, and hopefully you've designed against the types of risks that you're worried about.
So a couple of things. One is, and I take it, Manish, that you're going to agree with this, which is that it's both design and deployment. You know, you're never going to completely eliminate all the risks, right? You should build risk mitigation, ethical risk mitigation into the design process from the moment of, you know, trying to think about what the solution might look like to design and development. And then, you know, you're going to mitigate some risks along the way, and you'll never eliminate all of them. That's not possible. And then the question is whether the risks have been sufficiently mitigated such that we ought to deploy it. So we should allow for both kinds of decisions. The other thing is that I want to agree with one thing that Tulsi said, and then I think disagree with another. One is, the thing that I want to agree with is that, yes, it's going to vary. You're not going to be able to articulate your risk appetite so specifically that we already know what to do in every use case for every product. Rather, it's going to vary by use case, by product, yada, yada, yada. And also because we're talking about risk mitigation, not elimination, it's always going, you know, the business case and the legal case, et cetera, are going to vary by product, by use case as well. And the ethical risks are bound to be weighed against certain kinds of business risks, like we're going to go bankrupt. The thing that I want to push against, though, is a sort of thinking where what we should do is we should add up, and I don't know that, Tulsi, you mean to commit yourself to this, but it was said or implied anyway. So there's harms and benefits, and then you might think, look, what our ethical decision making ought to look like is let's add up all the benefits, let's add up all the harms, and let's make sure that the benefits outweigh the harms. And that's not, in my estimation, a good way of doing ethical decision making. So, for instance, and this is not my example, this is a famous example in moral philosophy. So you could have some kind of crude version of utilitarianism, which is essentially the right thing to do is make as many people as happy as you can. Classic counterexample, suppose we just find some, you know, random, unloved, homeless person with surprisingly healthy organs. We kidnap this person and we kill him and we harvest his organs and take 5 of his organs and put them in, otherwise dying such good people, parents and philanthropists, et cetera, and we save these lives. It's a benefit to humanity, yada, yada, yada. Most people would say, nonetheless, you're not justified in murdering the innocent homeless person and harvesting him for his organs. This is just to say that there's harms and benefits, which is one kind of thing to think about when you're thinking about the ethical impacts of what you're proposed to do. And then thinking about what it is to wrong someone or to violate someone's rights is another. And in those cases in which releasing the product entails wronging people, not just harming, not all harmings are wrongings, by the way, but in the case in which you are wronging them, that should be a massive red flag that we ought not to do this. I
think actually I don't disagree with anything you just said, right? I think it's a fair flag. And I think I was conflating a lot of things when I was talking about harms and benefits, but I think it's absolutely very valid that, like, when we talk about, first of all, wronging and harming are not the same thing. I fully agreed. And secondly, I think when you talk about even harms and benefits, I think when I frame it that way, it feels like this very utilitarian, let's add everyone up into the world and talk about like the pluses and the minuses. But certain harms are more severe for certain individuals in certain situations and in certain use cases of the product. And like that matters, right? And that severity may outweigh a small benefit that you're providing to a large number of people, right? And so I don't even think that actually it's worth kind of articulating that math problem in that way. I think it's more to say that I think that the decisions are nuanced product to product, and you should have frameworks for how you think about those decisions. And you should have frameworks that are consistent so that you're operating under kind of similar guiding principles. But I just think that they are nuanced, and there's not like a single framework for like, yes, if you hit a certain threshold, we can launch. Like, I don't think that is going to necessarily exist.
Yeah. I think we agree. Just two quick points. One is, in some cases, it's true that harming is not necessarily wrong, but in some cases, you harm people in such a way that you're obligated not to harm them in that way. So it would be wrong to harm them in that way. I think, Tulsi and I think we're in agreement. The other thing is that the one reason why I highlight is that because that kind of crass utilitarianism is often used by, for instance, Facebook to justify certain things that they do, right? So you're spreading this information, you're undermining, but we've done so much good, and sort of like that's not a relevant response, right? If we say you've wronged all these people, and the reply is, look at all the good we've done, that doesn't, as it were, undo the wrong you've done. And so I think it's my general view is that we should push to the forefront of ethical decision-making and ethical discussions the notion of wronging people, and it's being morally required of companies not to wrong people, so that they can't do this sort of PR duck of, well, look at all the benefits we provided as well. It's just not a relevant response.
Yeah. And I think you're hitting on one of the challenges of doing the work in the space of ethics and fairness is we don't actually agree on what is the right framework for fairness. And, is a utilitarian approach? Is it more of majoritarian rules? And I think that's one of the challenges where we may need more thought leadership from the nonprofit community or from the government. And one other aspect I wanted to add to the conversation is just the short-term versus long-term harm. I think if we look at, sometimes there's a short-term impact of people being put into bubbles, but over time that harm can grow. So we can see elections impacted and other commercial decisions made around that. So again, a lot of complexities here, and I'm enjoying hearing all the different ways that the three of you are thinking about it. We are almost out of time, but I wanted to ask a question about regulations. And so Manish, you had mentioned working especially in public policy. So I'm going to start with you. If you were to advise a policymaker now, like what are the key, that maybe 1, 2, or 3 key priorities a policymaker should be thinking about in terms of the AI and ethics space?
Good question. I think there's a few. So one is in context that we already have regulation for instance, any sort of decision-making that surrounds housing, employment, and credit, and those types of opportunities. There's a lack of clarity as to how those existing regulations and protections actually apply to algorithmic tools. One example I'll give you is from the stuff that I work on algorithms used in hiring. There's a lot of disagreement and confusion as to what discrimination actually means in the context of algorithmic decision-making. So I think even just the step of clarifying existing regulation and perhaps trying less hard to stretch it to account for these new tools and to really just issue new guidance on what it really means. I think that should be a priority. Another sort of separate strain of things is around privacy protections. California has already taken some steps in that direction. The EU has done so as well. But this ultimately needs to be sort of not a patchwork of different regulations, but a more centralized framework. The last thing that I want to highlight is that there is a push towards more transparency for online platforms and their use of AI in decision-making, in curating what we see and sort of making recommendations and so on. That sort of transparency, I think, is hugely important, and one that we really don't have a right to currently in the existing framework. So to the extent that regulation can guarantee us some amount of a window into how decisions are being made about us online, I think that'd be hugely valuable.
Reed and Tulsi.
I mean, I think Manish hit on three very strong points. I think, a point was made earlier. I think Manish, maybe you made it earlier, that we need regulation because we need consistency, right? And for those also who don't have necessarily the resources or the intentions or the awareness to do some of this work, regulation imposes a starting point, right? And it imposes a conversation. And I think I'd love to see just a lot more clarity in terms of how we're defining some of these questions. Like, what does it mean to do you think about fairness? Like, how are we actually defining that? And but I think a key part is I would love to see that in domain specific or context specific motions. I think one thing I get nervous about is making broad claims. This goes back to a lot of our conversations about nuance and products being use case specific. I think I get nervous about broad claims of like, this is what it means to be fair. And like all your models should do this, right? And the reality is like that could actually lead to, I think, worse outcomes because you end up with everyone evaluating something that's actually not the thing they should be evaluating in the first place. And so how do we make sure that we're having conversations that are actually domain specific, context specific, so that we're actually creating guidance and consistency in ways that are usable and solving the end problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. If I have to think about what regulation would be most effective and needed, my first thought, maybe it's not my first thought, but one of my bigger thoughts, or my primary thought, or maybe the most controversial one, is let's look at what healthcare did. So if you look at the healthcare industry, you've probably heard about the Tuskegee experiments in which doctors just watched the unmitigated progression of syphilis in Black men in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, so quite a long time. When this came to light, a bunch of things happened. Among those things that happened is there were regulations passed around requiring anyone who wanted to test on human subjects to first get approval from what is now called an IRB, or an institutional review board. This has gone, and notice that the institutional review board was, in addition to having certain kinds of education of healthcare practitioners and researchers. So these very smart people, doctors, nurses, et cetera, are educated about the ethical impacts of the kinds of things that they do and what they need to look out for, but it is not sufficient because they also need to get, in some cases, IRB approval when they're doing research. In my view, a lot of what the tech world is doing is experimenting on people, and the ethical implications vary wildly by use case. There's no single metric, to echo Tulsi's point. There's no single metric for fairness that we're just going to put across the board. And so what we need is something that is going to get into the process in a meaningful way, where ethical risks are spotted and mitigated, immediately by something like an independent board. That's what IRBs do in healthcare. I don't think that technologists are different than, say, doctors and nurses. I don't think they have a particular ability to acquire an ethics education and mitigate all the risks all by themselves. So my view is that one of the most important things and most powerful things that we could possibly do, and I have no judgment as to the probability of such a thing, it seems quite low, but having something like IRBs in the tech world seemed to me a powerful way of identifying and mitigating ethical risks in a systematic and comprehensive way. And we've seen it work already in the healthcare industry.
Okay, well, thank you for all your thoughts, Reed, Manish, Tulsi. What's the best way for people to find, follow, and otherwise get in touch with you?
That's a good question.
I'm on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I guess
ReedBlackman.com, whatever you like.
All right, great. LinkedIn, yes. And
Yeah.
I'm on social media as well, Abigail Hing Wen, and I have a newsletter for folks who are interested in following all the books and film where I touch on these topics as well. I want to say thank you again to the panelists, to everyone who dialed in, and to Arize, the whole team there, Aparna, Jason, and Maggie. Thanks for organizing us and bringing us together for this conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you. This was great.
Thanks so much, everyone.